Hello guys, this time I'm going to show you how to convert the pawn if the pawn is on the 7th rank, the king is in front of the pawn, and what is the so-called Lucena position. At the same time, you'll understand what are the components of so-called building the bridge method and how you need to handle this, and what are the ideas that you need to implement, and what are the ways that the opponent can try to stop you from reaching these ideas. I hope you'll understand all of this stuff step by step, and remember to revise and practice these positions. I'll divide this material into 3 parts. The first one will be about what happens if the king is taking off the escape squares for the king. The next one, what happens if the rook is taking off the escape square of the king. And the third one, what happens if both the king and the rook are cutting off the king from escaping from the dungeon. I hope you'll understand it, you'll enjoy it, at the same time you'll just practice this and you'll master this Lucena position, aka building the bridge method. Let's get into it. Let's have a look what happens if the rook cuts off the escape square for the king, but the defending king does not. Now, at this moment, as you can see, the king is able to escape from the other side without being harassed by the rook. And now this is the easiest way to win. As we can see, the king step back, release the promotion square, the rook gets the other way, we promote, and at the same time after the exchange we have the winning position. The next position is the following. The rook is cutting off the escape square from another side. It doesn't matter as it doesn't make any difference. It is something like a mirrored position. The idea of the winning is the same. The king step back, release the promotion square, the rook gets the other way, we are promoting the pawn into the queen, and after the trade we are winning. Now let's improve the position for the defending perspective. Now, as you can see, the black king is covering the escape squares for the king, and now at this moment the king takes more active role at this endgame. Now, how we can win with white? White is just covering the escaping route for the king, not being harassed by the rook, and now the rook is just going on the same file, the king escapes, after the king gets closer, the pawn is protected by the king, therefore the king cannot capture. Of course, the rook cannot throw the check neither here nor there, therefore after the capture we are just pushing back the king, and after capturing the rook we are just winning. And now at this moment, if I like to point out, there is alternative way to win. At this moment we can play rook check, after pushing the king from the c-file, now we can promote, and the result is the same. Therefore, 2 ways of winning at this position. Another one is the same position, but I just shifted the position 1 file right. And the method of winning is the same. We are just having the escape route covered by our rook, not being harassed by the opponent's rook. After the rook is going back and forth over the same file, covering the promoting square, we are just stepping back. After the king gets closer, we are just promoting, and after the capture, winning the rook. Or as I previously mentioned, we can make the alternative win to push back the king, and after that promote, and the same idea happens. Therefore, at this position, I guess you understand that the king alone cannot provide the good enough support for stopping the pawn from promotion, neither the rook. Now, what happens if we just try the other way? Now there is one more idea that I would like to point out. Take notice, at this moment, the rook is cutting off the king, escape route, the same as the king. And now, at this moment, we are just using a little bit different idea. After the rook is going back and forth, the king cannot make any legal move, we are reaching the rook to the 7th rank, and now we are just making the escape route possible, attacking the opponent's rook at the same time. After the rook stepping back, we are going right here. Now, take notice there is a double check from the new promoted queen and the rook. After double check, the only way legal move is to escape, and after that we are just winning. Therefore, at this moment, pretty simple idea. Now, the same one, but shifted 1 file left. And now the method is the same. Even though black, rook and the king are cutting off the king's escape, we are just covering this by the same idea. Reaching the rook on the 7th, providing the rook to be protected and the king to escape, releasing the promoting square, And after the rook is covering the promoting square and the king gets closer, we are making a double check with the queen and with the rook, and therefore winning easily. And now let's get into the Lucena position, and this is the so-called building the bridge idea. I'd like to show you why sometimes this is the only way to win at this type of position. Let's check out the other ideas. First, let's see what happens if we just throw the check, not to allow the opponent's king to have our king locked in front of the pawn. After the king step back, the king has the escape route. And now what happens? The black rook is just harassing the king. Take notice, the king cannot go down on the diagonal because the pawn will be captured. After the king tries to escape like that, you can see that the rook is attacking the pawn, and you cannot protect the pawn any other move when the king gets into the pawn, the diagonal one, and again, rook is harassing the king. And of course, if the king will be going back and forth, we have the repetition, and of course, if the king gets in front of the pawn, the king doesn't make any improvement. Of course, there is another idea that I would like to show you. Now, we just started with rook d2 check. What happens if we start with the rook h2 and we are just throwing the horizontal checks, not the vertical ones? Now, after the rook is not allowing the king to escape, the same as the king, now the white rook is harassing the king from the side, from the 7th and from the 8th ranks. And now at this moment, if the rook would be harassing the king, will be going back and forth. After free position occurs the same, we have the threefold repetition, the game ends in a draw. And now at this moment, if the rook will be going a little bit into the 7th rank, not forcing the king to go back and forth over the 7 and 8 ranks, we can get back and forth over the a file with the rook. And now the position repeats or occurs for 3 times the same one, and then we declare a draw as well. Therefore, at this way, this position cannot be won neither by the only ideas with throwing the check from the bottom or throwing the check from the side. It cannot be won only by these ideas. And now let's check out what would happen if we improve this idea as we just mentioned a while ago. Now, we start with the rook check. Now the king has 4 moves to go. 3 moves on the e file and 1 move on the c file. What happens if the king gets to c6? Of course, this is the easiest for us to make, because now after the king c8, there is no checkmate as the pawn attacks the promoting square and capture diagonally. After the king step back, after the rook step back trying to make the checkmate idea work, we are promoting the pawn into the queen, and after the check, we are just blocking the check, and after the capture, we are winning easily. And that's why this move, king c6, doesn't help too much. And now what happens if we get the other way? If the king gets into the 7th. Now, at this moment, we are going with the rook on the 4th rank. Now, the rook is cutting off the king's escape, and now we can go into one of these 2 squares. The king gets right here to the c7 square. The rook is harassing the king. After the king gets in behind the pawn, it is harassed again. And now, after the king gets into a6, we have the following plan. Getting our rook to the 5th rank, into the d5, then into the b5, because the rook will be protected and the promoting square will be covered by the rook. And now, if the rook is harassing the king still, we are just making so-called classical Lucena position, aka building the bridge. After the king step back, the square on the back rank is covered by the pawn, and now the threat is to promote the pawn. After the rook throws the check with the idea of getting the king into one of the squares on the 5th rank in order to capture the pawn, now we are just making the blockade for the rook, and now after the captures, the king is too far away to capture the pawn, and we are promoting the pawn into the queen. And that's why this is the classical Lucena. If the king gets into the 6th rank in order to harass the rook, now we are making this idea work. The rook is behind the king cannot be harassed, and now we are getting with the king into a7, then the pawn into b8 queen, and now this was the idea I just showed you previously. After the king gets closer, we are going with the idea of promoting, because the king will be protecting the new promoted queen. After the king gets closer, Either we are making the promotion with check, forcing the rook to capture and then regaining the material, or we can make the other way, as I just mentioned previously, throwing the check, after the king step back, now making the promotion, and after the capture we win anyway. Therefore, at this moment you can see that this is the main idea. And now I would like to point out one more thing at this position, because it's very important to understand it a little bit deeper. And now, after the rook d4, we can try to get king c7 immediately, right? But it's not possible, because the rook will be harassing the king all the time and will not make any progress. Therefore, after we push back the king, we cannot get with the king immediately, because it doesn't help. First, we are getting the rook on the 4th, because after the king will be on the 5th rank after some harassment for the rook, we are just blocking on the 4th rank. And that's the main idea. And now one more time, if the king gets into the a6 square and being harassed one more time, we are going right there in order to block the 4th rank by the rook and having this rook protected. And after this exchange of the rooks, we are winning. Now, if the king gets into the e6, we can try this idea as well, because the king is not covering the back rank, and we are trying to make the pawn promotion. But this idea simply doesn't work, because the king doesn't have the space to escape. And now, after throwing the checks, being harassed again, the king cannot get neither of these sides, because the pawn will be captured. After the king gets right here, the king cannot escape via the d file, because it's going to be harassed all over again. And that's why, again, the rook is going to the 4th rank, and now we are just winning due to this idea to make the position winning by blocking the b file. And now the same position, but this time shifted one file right. The ideas are pretty the same. We start with the check. Again, if the king gets into the 6th rank, we are stepping back. Take notice, the rook cannot get, because we just capture with. After the rook gets the other way, we promote, then we block, and after the trade of the rooks, we are winning. That's why, after rook check, the king decides to get to the 7th rank. And now what's going on? At this moment, as we just mentioned, the rook gets to the 4th rank. Now the rook is going back and forth, not allowing the king to escape. Take notice, the rook cannot get to the 4th rank because it's going to be captured. After the king escapes, rook throwing the check again, and now again. If the rook would be throwing more checks, we are getting with the king to the 5th rank. After the rook throwing the check, because there was the threat of promotion, we are blocking with the rook, and after the trade of the rooks, we are promoting the pawn. Take notice, the king is too far away to capture the pawn. And now, what happens if the king gets closer in order to harass the rook? Now, there are two ways of winning. The first way being getting the rook to the last rank, the second one getting the rook not being harassed by the rook from the bottom onto the b4 square. After rook b4, now the king gets closer, and the same methods as we just mentioned before. Therefore, pretty easy. But what would happen if we get to the back rank? This time it works. Why? Because we have at least two empty files to make the leaf idea work. Leaf idea, or you can say flying leaf idea or falling leaf idea. I'll be using this interchangeably. Now, after throwing the check, the king gets closer, and after the pawn promotes, the rook must capture, and we are winning easily. And therefore, at this moment, I guess you understand this idea, that whenever the king gets too close into the rook, we can throw the rook, and after getting into the first rank, the rook will be protecting the new promoted pawn, and this would be winning as well. Now, what happens if we have the pawn and the king shifted one more file right as well? Now, the same idea works as well. After king e6, again, the rook cannot throw the check because we'll capture and promote with our check. After the rook goes the other way with so-called the checkmate threat, it's not a checkmate threat because we can block with the rook, and after the trade, we are just winning. And now, at this moment, the king gets to the 7th rank, the same as the pawn. Now, the rook gets to the 4th rank, because this is the main idea with so-called building the bridge position or Lucena position, reaching Lucena position. The rook is not getting the opportunity for the king to escape from the left side, and now the king tries to escape from the right side. Now, after throwing the check, take notice, the king cannot get neither of this side because the king is covering these squares as well. After throwing the check, again, if the rook will be throwing more checks, we are going a little bit down. After throwing the check, rook blocks, and the pawn promotes next 3 moves, as the king is too far away. And now what happens if the rook is not harassing the king, is just covering the promoting square? The king is going down. Again, we are winning either by the rook onto c4 and then king c7, a8, d8 queen, or we can immediately get to the back rank and then getting the pawn promoted, because the king will be going into the falling leaf idea or flying leaf idea, if you wish. And now, after the rook gets behind the pawn, rook gets behind the king not to allow the rook to harass the king. Now the king gets closer, we are getting closer. After this trade we know already, we are winning. Of course, we can get rook f8 idea instead of rook c4. This works as well. As we can see, the king is getting closer and closer with this idea, and the rook must capture the promoted queen, and we are winning again. And now the last position. At this moment, we will just look at one important distinction, because some of you may be a little bit concerned. Now, what happens if the rook of the opponents is already on the 4th rank, therefore we are not able to make into the 4th rank, you may ask, because you may be a little bit confused. What can I do if the rook is covering the 4th rank and I cannot get the rook to the 4th rank? Let's check it out. After throwing the check, again, if the king gets to the 6th rank, the win is pretty easy, as we explained previously. Therefore, king e6 loses on the spot. What happens if the king gets to the 7th rank? Now, rook f3, we are just waiting, and now the rook cannot cover the f4 square, because the rook must cover these squares on the c file. And now, if the king gets into the back rank, right here, now again, we cannot get closer. But what happens now? We are getting with the king, and now after the throwing the check, we are going closer, throwing the check, we are going here, and now take notice, the rook must go down. If the rook throws the check right there, we are going closer, the rook cannot throw this check, and after going here, we are promoting with check. And that's the issue, that the rook cannot capture our king. Of course, at this moment, we can just block with the rook. We are not harassed by the bottom. The rook cannot have the square controlled, and the king is too far away to capture the pawn. Therefore, either pawn promoting with check, either rook blocking the opportunity for the rook to attack our king from the bottom wins as well. Therefore, pawn promotes with check. That's the issue, why you shouldn't put the king in the back rank. If the pawn is on the 7th, it's better to put the king on the 7th, unless you must put the king on the 8th. Therefore, it's worth remembering. And now, at this position, if the rook gets into the 2nd rank, now we are just going the standard idea with the rook covering the opportunity for the other rook to harass our king. The king gets closer, we are just having the square covered, the rook cannot harass us from the bottom, and now after the king gets closer, we just winning the rook. This is the idea. And one more stuff, after rook c3, because this is the simplest stuff, we can get rook f5. I just put the exclamation point, because normally we play rook f4. Rook f5 is just exclamation point, because we can bring the rook onto the d5, then the pawn promote, and the king can go here if necessary. Take notice, rook f5 is only because the king is not on the 7th, but on the 8th rank. If the king was on the 7th, we have the rook on the 4th rank. If the king is on the 8th, we can bring the rook up to the 5th rank as well. And now, after the king gets closer, as I just mentioned, we are just covering the promoting square, the rook is being protected, after capture, we are promoting the pawn. And I hope so you understand this type of ideas, how the Lucena or the building the bridge method works, how they are making all of the elements into the full position, how they work one by one, and why the rook and the king must cut off the king from getting outside the pawn, otherwise our work is way easier. Remember, you need to revise this position and practice them, because if you do not practice, I'm not sure if you'll be remembering how to do so in a practical application, especially if you are low on time, stressed, or the game dragged for hours. And now, I hope so it is everything that you would like to know about so-called Lucena position, what is the idea behind the building the bridge method, and what are the components, or you can say elements, that you need to take into account in order to understand all of the process, all of the mechanism of all of this stuff step by step. I hope you understand this, all of this stuff step by step, analyzing these positions. If something you do not understand or you are not, let's say, grasping immediately, let me know in the comments. Maybe there are some mistakes as well, because sometimes I am just pretty much focused what's going on and may miss simple ideas as well. And of course, take notice that this stuff needs to be taken into practice, and step by step, if you practice this, it will become a second nature. And now at this episode, we just learned what is going on about the Lucena position, aka building the bridge method, and what happens if the king and the rook is cutting off the king escape route, and how to overcome it, how to break it, and how to convert the pawn into the queen. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Thanks for watching.